Loneliness opened 3 doors in my life, and behind each one was something that wanted to claim me. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. I am 91 years old now, and I have learned that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones hiding under your bed, but the ones who hold the door open for you with a charming smile. What I am about to tell you are 3 first date stories from my own life. Before you go on a first date, know your partner well, and be careful not to go to isolated places. 3 times I sat across from someone new, hoping to make a connection, and instead, I found terror. The first happened in the spring of 1956, when I was 23 years old and working as a secretary at a small accounting firm in downtown Boston called Henderson and Associates. Life was fairly ordinary back then. The war had been over for 11 years, and the city was rebuilding itself with a kind of desperate optimism. Everyone wanted to believe the worst was behind us. I was young, unmarried, and according to my mother, my time was running out. In those days, a woman my age without a husband was considered almost tragic. My high school friends were already having their second or third babies, hosting dinner parties, comparing curtain patterns. Meanwhile, I was eating tuna sandwiches at my desk and riding the streetcar home alone every evening. So when Thomas Brennan asked me out to dinner, I said yes before my brain could catch up with my mouth. Let me give you a piece of advice. Don't force yourself into something you're not ready for just because of other people's words and expectations, even if that person is your mother. Thomas worked in the building next to mine, in some sort of import business I never quite understood. I'd seen him around the neighborhood, tall, well-dressed, with dark hair slicked back the way all men wore it back then. He was genuinely handsome, the type my mother would have called well brought up, polite, soft-spoken, the kind of man who tipped his hat to women on the street. He introduced himself one rainy afternoon while we were both standing under the same awning, watching a downpour turn Tremont Street into a river. We made brief conversation about the weather, work, trivial things, but he remembered my name. And 2 weeks later, he appeared outside my office building, holding a bouquet of white roses. "Margaret," he said with that easy smile of his, "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me on Friday evening. There's a lovely Italian restaurant in the North End I think you'd enjoy." My co-workers were watching from the windows, giggling like schoolgirls. How could I possibly say no? Friday arrived as if at the speed of light, and I was excited. I wore my nicest dress, navy blue with white polka dots, cinched at the waist with a thin belt. My roommate Dorothy helped me style my hair in the popular fashion of the time, soft curls framing my face. "He sounds like a dreamboat," Dorothy said, fastening my pearl necklace. Maybe this one's actually decent. I'd had exactly 3 dates in my entire life before Thomas, and all of them had ended in awkward handshakes and mutual disinterest. But something about Thomas felt different. He seemed genuinely interested in me, not just looking for a wife to cook his meals and bear his children. Thomas picked me up at 7 sharp, driving a beautiful black Buick that gleamed under the streetlights. He opened my door, helped me into the passenger seat, and drove us through the city streets with the radio playing soft jazz. The restaurant was called Giacomo's, tucked into a narrow street in the North End, where the smell of garlic and fresh bread hung in the air like a promise. Inside, candles flickered on red checkered tablecloths, and an older Italian woman greeted Thomas by name. "Ah, Mr. Brennan, your usual table?" He'd been here before, many times apparently. We sat in a corner booth, and for the first hour, everything was perfect. Thomas asked about my work, my family, my dreams. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen for the first time in years. We talked about books, about the new movies playing at the Paramount, about whether Boston winters were truly worse than New York winters. "You're not like other girls," he said at one point, and I blushed, even though I knew it was a line he'd probably used before. But then something shifted. It started small. The waiter brought our entrees, chicken parmigiana for me, veal for Thomas, and as I reached for my fork, Thomas gently placed his hand over mine. "Let me cut that for you," he said softly. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. "I think I can manage." His smile didn't change, but his grip tightened just slightly. "I insist. A lady shouldn't have to work during dinner." There was something in his tone, something that wasn't quite a request. I pulled my hand back slowly, trying to keep my voice light. "Really, Thomas, I'm fine." For just a moment, his eyes went cold. Then the warmth returned, and he laughed like nothing had happened. "Of course. Forgive me. I'm a bit old-fashioned." I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid, but my stomach had started to knot. The conversation continued, but I noticed he was steering it differently now. Every question he asked felt like it had a purpose. "Do you live alone, or do you have roommates?" Be honest. Would you still be answering his questions, or would you already be looking for the exit? "What time do you usually get home from work?" "Does your family live nearby?" I answered vaguely, instinct telling me not to give too much detail. And each time I deflected, I saw that flicker again, that brief coldness behind his eyes before the charm slid back into place. When dessert came, Thomas excused himself to use the restroom. I sat there, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine, when the older Italian woman who'd greeted us earlier approached my table. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should leave." I blinked. "I'm sorry." That man, He brings different girls here. Every few weeks, a new one. They never come back." She glanced toward the restroom. "I mind my business, but you seem like a nice girl. Leave now, while you can." My blood went cold. "What do you mean they never come back?" She shook her head. "Just go, please." Before I could ask anything else, I heard the restroom door open. The woman hurried back toward the kitchen, and Thomas returned to the table, smiling that same easy smile. "Everything all right?" he asked, sliding back into the booth. "Actually," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I'm not feeling well. I think I should go home." His smile froze. "We haven't even had dessert yet." "I'm sorry. I think it was something I ate. I really need to leave." I stood, grabbing my purse, and Thomas stood too, his hand closing around my wrist. Not hard, but firm. "Margaret, don't be ridiculous. Sit down." The restaurant had gone quiet. Other diners were watching now. "Let go of me," I said clearly, loud enough for others to hear. He released my wrist immediately, that charming smile snapping back into place. "Of course. I'm sorry if I startled you. Let me at least drive you home." Every instinct I had screamed, "No." "That's not necessary. I'll take the trolley." "It's nearly 9 o'clock. A young woman alone on the trolley at this hour? I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you." The way he said it, like a threat wrapped in concern, made my skin crawl. "I'll be fine," I said, already moving toward the door. He followed me out onto the street, still trying to convince me to let him drive me home. I walked fast, heels clicking on the cobblestones, searching desperately for a cab, for a police officer, for anyone. And then I saw it. A police call box on the corner, the red light glowing like a beacon. I ran for it, pulled open the door, and grabbed the phone inside. Thomas stopped following, standing under a streetlight about 20 feet away, watching me with an expression I'll never forget. Not angry, not surprised, just calculating, like he was deciding whether I was worth the trouble. The operator answered. "Boston Police. What's your emergency?" I need help. There's a man following me." "Where are you, miss?" I gave her the intersection, my voice shaking. "Please hurry." Thomas didn't run. He just tipped his hat, turned, and walked calmly back toward the restaurant. By the time the police arrived 5 minutes later, he was gone. The officers took my statement, asked if I wanted to press charges. But charges for what? He hadn't technically done anything illegal. He'd been a gentleman right up until he wasn't. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, drove me home in his patrol car. On the way, he said something that stayed with me for 68 years. "We've had reports about a man matching that description. 3 women in the past year. They all described the same thing. Charming at first, then something wrong. We could never get enough to arrest him. But," he paused, 2 of those women disappeared within a week of their reports. We never found them. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. What was his name? The man you were investigating? We never got a positive ID. He used different names, different restaurants. Always well-dressed, always polite. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror. You were smart to trust your gut, miss. That might have saved your life. I never saw Thomas Brennan again. But 6 months later, I read a story in the Boston Globe about the discovery of 4 women's bodies in a warehouse basement in Charlestown. The article mentioned that police were looking for a suspect described as well-dressed, mid-30s, often seen at restaurants in the North End. They never caught him. The case went cold, and the newspapers moved on to other horrors. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that moment in the restaurant when he tried to cut my food for me, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the way the Italian woman whispered, "They never come back." I learned something that night in 1956 that I've never forgotten. Charm is a weapon, and the most dangerous predators are the ones who've learned to use it perfectly. If you believe charm can be more dangerous than violence, subscribe. There are 2 more stories you need to hear. I was 45 the second time I learned that first dates can turn into nightmares. I was divorced, and I should have known better. But loneliness has a way of pushing you into bad decisions, no matter your age or experience. It finds the cracks in your armor and whispers that maybe, just maybe, this time will be different. It was the fall of 1978, and I had been divorced from my second husband for 3 years. Richard was a good man, steady, dependable, about as exciting as watching paint dry. We had spent 15 years together before mutually admitting that we were more like roommates than spouses. He wasn't a bad person, but the feeling had drained out of the relationship. The separation was amicable. No drama, no tears, just 2 people who had run out of things to say to each other. At the time, I was teaching English at a public high school in Cambridge and living alone in a small apartment near Harvard Square. My daughter from my first marriage was grown and living in California. My son with Richard was finishing college. I was proud that the children I had worked so hard to raise were standing on their own feet. And I, too, had finally regained my independence. Time for my books and Sunday crossword puzzles in the garden. But the truth was, I was lonely. And in 1978, there weren't many options for a 45-year-old divorced woman who wanted to meet someone. There were no dating apps or internet, just blind dates, church events, and the occasional awkward encounter at the supermarket. That's where I met Dr. Robert Ashford, literally in the produce aisle of the Star Market on Mass Avenue, both of us reaching for the same bunch of grapes. Like something out of a movie, right? Then again, movies borrow more from real life than people realize. I think you had your eye on them first. he said with a warm smile, gesturing for me to take them. We could split them, I offered, and he laughed. A genuine, comfortable sound that made something in my chest loosen. We ended up talking for 20 minutes right there in the produce aisle. He was a psychiatrist with a practice in Brookline, recently widowed with 2 grown sons. He had silver hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice that was soothing in the way that made you want to tell him your secrets. Before we parted, he asked if I'd like to have dinner sometime. I said yes, and we exchanged phone numbers written on the backs of grocery receipts. Our first call lasted 2 hours. He asked thoughtful questions about my teaching, my interests, my perspective on life. He talked about his late wife, Martha, who'd died of cancer 2 years earlier, with a tenderness that made me believe he was someone who knew how to love deeply. I'm not looking to replace her, he said softly, but I'm also not looking to spend the rest of my life alone. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. It was exactly what I was feeling. We set a date for the following Saturday. He insisted on picking me up, and when he arrived at my door holding a bouquet of chrysanthemums, my favorite, though I hadn't told him, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. He took me to Loch Ober, one of the finest restaurants in Boston. White tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, waiters in tuxedos. It was the kind of place I'd only been once before, for my parents' anniversary when I was a child. "This is too much," I protested as we were seated. "Nonsense," Robert said, pulling out my chair. "A woman like you deserves to be treated well." The first hour was magical. We talked about everything: literature, music, politics, philosophy. He'd read all the same books I had, shared my love of classical music, agreed with my thoughts on Carter's presidency. It was like talking to someone who'd been designed specifically to match me. But then, gradually, the conversation began to shift. "Tell me about your marriages," he said as our entrees arrived. "What went wrong?" I hesitated. It seemed like an odd question for a first date. But he was a psychiatrist. Maybe he was just professionally curious. "My first husband was unfaithful," I said carefully. "My second was... we just grew apart." Robert nodded thoughtfully, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "Do you think you contributed to either failure?" That question, was it concern or control? Like if you felt the shift too. The question landed like a slap. "I'm sorry?" "I'm not being accusatory," he said quickly, that warm smile returning. "I'm simply asking if you've examined your own role in those relationships ending. Self-reflection is important for growth." I set down my fork. "I think both marriages ended for complex reasons. I don't think it's fair to assign blame to one person." "Of course not," he agreed. "But you must admit, Margaret, there's a common factor in both failed marriages: you." The way he said it, so gentle, so reasonable, made me doubt my own reaction. Was he being cruel, or was I being defensive? I suppose that's technically true, I said slowly. He reached across the table and took my hand. I'm only trying to help you see patterns. That's what I do. I help people understand themselves better. His thumb rubbed circles on my palm. You're clearly intelligent, accomplished, attractive. So why do you think you keep ending up alone? My throat tightened. I don't know that I keep ending up alone. I've been married twice. And divorced twice, he pointed out, still smiling that kind smile. I'm not judging, Margaret. I'm simply observing. You seem to have difficulty maintaining long-term connections. The waiter appeared to refill our water glasses, and I used the interruption to pull my hand back. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't tell if it was from anger or confusion. Maybe we should talk about something else, I suggested. Of course, Robert said easily. I apologize if I made you uncomfortable. It's an occupational hazard. I'm always analyzing. He paused. Though I notice you're deflecting rather than engaging with the question. That's interesting. I'm not deflecting, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I just don't think my divorce history is appropriate first date conversation. He sat back, studying me with those kind eyes that suddenly didn't seem quite so kind. You're absolutely right. Forgive me. Let's talk about your daughter instead. You mentioned she lives in California? The rest of the dinner continued in that same unsettling pattern. Every topic somehow circled back to what was wrong with me. My fear of intimacy, my tendency to intellectualize emotions, my difficulty accepting criticism. And each time, he'd frame it as help, as insight, as the caring observations of someone who wanted to see me grow. I think you're very hard on yourself, he said as we waited for dessert. You hold yourself to impossible standards, and then you're surprised when you fall short. It's a self-defeating pattern. By the time he drove me home, I felt hollowed out, small, like every decision I'd ever made had been wrong, and he was the only one kind enough to point it out. He walked me to my door, and before I could say goodnight, he cupped my face in his hands. Margaret, I had a wonderful evening. You're a fascinating woman. He kissed my forehead gently. I hope you'll let me see you again. I think I could really help you work through some of these issues. I stood there, key in hand, unable to form words. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, but another part, a larger part, wondered if he was right, if I really was as damaged as he seemed to think. I'll call you, I finally managed. He smiled. I'll look forward to it. I watched him drive away, then went inside and sat in the dark for an hour, replaying the entire evening. Had I overreacted? Was he just trying to have meaningful conversation? Or had I just spent 3 hours being slowly dissected by someone who knew exactly how to make cruelty sound like concern? Robert called the next morning, and the morning after that, and the one after that. Each conversation followed the same pattern. He'd ask how I was, express concern, then subtly point out ways I could improve myself. "You sound tired, Margaret. Are you sleeping enough? Sleep deprivation can exacerbate anxiety." I noticed you hesitated before answering. Do you have difficulty making decisions? You're very defensive today. That's often a sign of deep-seated insecurity. After a week, I stopped answering his calls. But he didn't stop trying. He sent letters, long, thoughtful letters, about how he understood I was processing and needed space to work through my resistance to help. He sent flowers with cards that said things like, "Thinking of you during this difficult time," as if I were grieving rather than simply avoiding him. He showed up at my school once, waiting in the parking lot after my last class. When I saw his car, my stomach dropped. "Margaret," he called out, getting out of the car. "I've been worried about you. You haven't been returning my calls." "Robert, I think it's best if we don't see each other anymore." His face fell with such convincing sadness that I almost apologized. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, I don't think we're compatible." "Because I challenged you to grow? Because I cared enough to be honest?" He stepped closer. "Margaret, you're doing it again. You're running away instead of facing your patterns. This is exactly what I was trying to help you see." A few of my students were watching from across the parking lot. I lowered my voice. "Please, leave. I mean it." Something flickered in his eyes, just for a second. The mask slipped, and I saw what was underneath. Not kindness, not concern, something cold and calculating and cruel. But then the mask snapped back into place. "I understand. You're not ready. That's okay." He handed me a business card. "When you are ready to do the real work, call me. I'll be here." He drove away, and I stood there shaking, the business card crumpling in my fist. I threw it in the nearest trash can and went home, double-checking my locks for the first time in years. The calls continued for another month before finally stopping. I later learned from a colleague who knew someone in his practice that I wasn't the first woman he'd targeted. He had a pattern: recent widow or divorcee, preferably someone educated and self-sufficient, someone who would see his help as flattering rather than predatory. He would slowly dismantle their self-worth, make them dependent on his guidance, and then either control them completely or discard them when they finally saw through him. I was lucky. I saw through him early, but I spent the next year questioning every decision I made, hearing his voice in my head pointing out my flaws, my patterns, my failures. It took a good therapist, a real one, to help me understand what had happened. That Robert Ashford wasn't trying to help me grow. He was trying to break me down so he could rebuild me into someone he could control. Gaslighting, my therapist called it. Making someone doubt their own perception of reality until they become dependent on you to tell them what's true. I never saw Robert again, but I heard years later that he'd lost his license after a patient filed a complaint. Apparently, I wasn't the only one he'd tried his techniques on. That experience taught me something darker than the first date ever did. The man in 1956 wanted to hurt my body. Robert Ashford wanted to hurt my mind. And in some ways, that was worse, because at least with physical danger, you know you're in danger. Psychological manipulation wraps itself in concern and care. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're not sure if you can trust yourself anymore. I'm 91 years old now, and I can spot a manipulator within 5 minutes of conversation. I know the patterns, the subtle digs disguised as observations, the way they make you feel crazy for feeling uncomfortable. And if there's one thing I want younger women to understand, it's this. If someone makes you feel small while insisting they're helping you grow, run. Don't walk. Run, because the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who announce their intentions. They're the ones who convince you that the cage they're building is for your own protection. I was 86, the third and final time. I learned that some doors should never be opened, and I should have been wise enough not to make such a mistake. But grief, no matter how many years we've lived, always finds a way to make fools of us all. My third husband, James, had died 6 months earlier. Lung cancer, fast and ruthless. We had shared 12 lovely years together, not passionate, not earth-shattering, but comfortable and gentle. At our age, how passionate or whirlwind could love really be? As the years pass, relationships become more about reason than excitement. He was a retired postal worker with a dry sense of humor and a talent for solving puzzles. We spent our evenings reading side by side, occasionally sharing an interesting passage out loud. After he died, the silence in our apartment became unbearable. I had fallen into an unimaginable emptiness. My daughter called every Sunday from California, her voice tight with worry. My son visited as often as he could, but he had his own family, his own life. Friends from the senior center tried to pull me into activities, book clubs, bridge games, exercise classes. But without James sitting in his chair by the window, everything felt hollow. That was when my granddaughter Emma suggested I try online dating sites. "Grandma, there are apps specifically for seniors now," she said during one of her visits, holding up her phone. "Look, Silver Singles, Our Time, even regular dating apps have age filters. You could meet someone nice." I laughed at first. "Emma, I'm 86 years old. I'm not going to find love on a telephone." "It's not a telephone. It's an app. And why not? You're sharp, you're healthy, you're ancient," I finished for her. But she was persistent, and eventually I let her help me create a profile on something called Silver Singles. She took a photo of me in my garden, wrote a bio that made me sound far more interesting than I felt, and showed me how to swipe through potential matches. Most of them looked as tired and lonely as I felt. Widowers in baseball caps holding fish they'd caught. Divorced men whose profiles were filled with complaints about their ex-wives. Retired professionals who listed their stock portfolios in their bios. And then I saw him, William Thorne. His profile said he was 84, a widower of 2 years, former literature professor at a small college in New Hampshire. His photo showed a man with white hair, gentle eyes, and a slight smile that reminded me of someone, though I couldn't place who. His bio was simple. Looking for someone to share quiet evenings and good conversation. I believe we're never too old to find connection. I swiped right, more out of curiosity than hope. We matched immediately. His first message came within minutes. Margaret, I see you taught English for 30 years. I spent 40 years trying to convince undergraduates that Shakespeare was worth reading. We have that particular brand of battle scars in common. I smiled at my phone, actually smiled, and wrote back. We messaged for 2 weeks before he suggested meeting in person. He lived in Concord, about an hour north of Boston, but offered to drive down to meet me at a coffee shop near my apartment in Cambridge. I'm old-fashioned, he wrote. I don't believe in making a lady travel. On the day of our date, I spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing an outfit, finally settling on a simple navy dress and the pearl necklace James had given me for our 5th anniversary. Emma had offered to come wait nearby just in case, but I'd waved her off. I survived 2 world wars, 3 husbands, and 40 years of teaching teenagers, I told her. I think I can handle 1 coffee date. I wish I'd let her come. The coffee shop was one of those modern places that sold $12 lattes and had too many plants hanging from the ceiling. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table by the window where I could watch for William's arrival. At exactly 3 o'clock, I saw him walking up the sidewalk. Tall, slightly stooped, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned not to trust their knees. He was wearing a brown cardigan and carrying a book, Middlemarch by George Eliot, which made me smile. A man who brought reading material to a first date was my kind of person. But as he got closer to the door, something made me pause. The way he moved wasn't quite right. Not wrong exactly, but off. Like he was remembering how to walk rather than just walking. He entered the shop, and his eyes found mine immediately. Too immediately. Like he'd known exactly where I'd be sitting. Margaret, he said, his voice warm and familiar, in a way that sent ice down my spine. It's wonderful to finally meet you in person. He slid into the chair across from me before I could stand, and that's when I noticed his hands. They were folded on the table, perfectly still. in a way that no one's hands are ever perfectly still. No small movements, no adjusting, no fidgeting, just absolutely, unnaturally motionless. "You look exactly like your photo," he continued, that gentle smile never wavering. "Though I must say, pictures don't do you justice." "Thank you," I managed, my throat suddenly dry. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" "I don't believe so, though perhaps in another life." He tilted his head slightly. "Do you believe in that sort of thing, Margaret? Past lives, connections that transcend time?" It was an odd question for small talk, but I answered honestly, "I've never given it much thought." He unfolded his hands, the movement mechanical, deliberate, and gestured toward the counter. "Shall I get us some coffee? How do you take yours?" "Black, please, no sugar." He stood and walked to the counter, and I watched him carefully. That same strange quality to his movement, like a marionette operated by someone who'd studied human motion but never quite mastered it. I pulled out my phone, intending to text Emma, when I noticed something that made my breath catch. William's profile picture, the one I'd been looking at for 2 weeks, was gone. Not deleted, not changed, gone, like it had never existed. And in its place was just a gray silhouette, the default image the app used when someone hadn't uploaded a photo. My hands started to shake as I opened our message history. Everything was there. All our conversations, all his thoughtful responses. But his profile picture, in every single message, had been replaced with that gray silhouette. Pause for a second. What would you do if this happened to you? Tell me below. William returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting mine in front of me with that too perfect smile. "Black, no sugar, just as you like it." "William," I said carefully, "I was just looking at your profile, and your photo seems to have disappeared. Did you delete it?" He tilted his head again, the movement identical to before, like a recorded gesture being replayed. "My photo? No, I haven't touched my profile since we matched. Perhaps it's a technical glitch. These apps are always having problems." I wanted to believe that. I tried to believe that. But everything about him felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. "Tell me about your late wife," I said, testing him. "You mentioned she passed 2 years ago." "Martha," he said immediately. "She was everything to me. Lung cancer, I'm afraid. It took her quickly." My blood turned to ice. My James had died of lung cancer. I'd mentioned that in my profile, in the section about what I'd learned from loss. "That must have been difficult," I said slowly. "What was her maiden name?" He blinked, the first time I'd seen him blink since sitting down. "I'm sorry." "Her maiden name, before you were married, Anderson," he said, after a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long. "Martha Anderson." I'd never mentioned my maiden name in my profile, but I'd mentioned that my grandmother's name was Martha, and that she'd taught me to love reading. He was pulling details from my profile and rearranging them, wearing them like a costume. "You're not William Thorne," I said quietly. His smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Something that made every primitive instinct I had start screaming. "Of course I am. We've been talking for 2 weeks." "Who are you?" The coffee shop was busy. Students on laptops, parents with strollers, the barista calling out orders. But suddenly, all the sound seemed muffled, distant, like someone had wrapped the world in cotton. "I'm whoever you need me to be," he said, and his voice had changed. It was still his voice, but underneath it was something else, something that sounded like wind through empty rooms. "Isn't that what you wanted, Margaret? Someone who understood you? Someone who knew exactly what to say?" I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The room had started to tilt, edges blurring like a watercolor painting left in the rain. "You've been so lonely," he continued, reaching across the table. His hand was cold, not cool, but cold like stone that had never seen sunlight. "I can fix that. I can be him, the one you've been waiting for all these years, the one who finally understands." His face was shifting now, features sliding like wax. For a moment, he looked like Thomas from 1956, then like Robert from 1978, then like James, my dead husband, smiling at me from across the table. "I've been watching you for so long," he said, with James's face and that wrong voice. "Ever since you opened that door in 1956, ever since you invited me in with your hope, your loneliness, your desperate need to not be alone. You all do it eventually, you lonely ones. You open just enough for us to slip through." The world snapped back into focus with the sound of breaking glass. A barista had dropped a cup, and the crash jolted me back into my body. I lurched to my feet, grabbing my purse, and ran for the door. Behind me, I heard him call out, not with James's voice now, but with something older, something that had never been human. "You can't run from what you invited in, Margaret. I'll be waiting, in every profile, every photo, every lonely night. I'll be there." I burst out onto the sidewalk and kept running until my lungs burned and my knees threatened to give out. I ended up in the doorway of a bookstore 3 blocks away, gasping, crying, an elderly woman having what must have looked like a breakdown. A kind young man who worked there brought me water and asked if I needed help. I told him I was fine, just dizzy, just old. He offered to call someone, but I shook my head and waited until I could breathe normally again. When I finally pulled out my phone to call Emma, I saw that William's profile had vanished completely. Not just his photo, everything. Our entire conversation history, gone, like he'd never existed. But when I checked my notifications, there was a new match waiting. Different name, different photo, but the same eyes, the same too perfect smile. Looking for someone to share quiet evenings and good conversation, the bio read. I believe we're never too old to find connection. I deleted the app, then I deleted it again when it reappeared on my phone. Then a third time. It's been 4 years since that coffee shop. I never did try online dating again. I see my grandchildren. I read my books. I tend my garden. I'm still lonely sometimes, but I've learned that loneliness is better than the alternative. Because I understand now what that thing was. Not a ghost, not a demon. Something older than either. Something that feeds on the gaps we leave when we broadcast our loneliness into the void, hoping someone out there is listening, and something is always listening. Emma asks me sometimes why I won't even try one of those apps again. You just had one bad experience, Grandma. Most people on there are normal. I don't tell her the truth. I don't tell her that I still see him sometimes, standing across the street from my building, or that my phone will occasionally open to silver singles on its own, showing me a new profile with familiar eyes, or that I've learned to sleep with all the lights on because darkness invites things in, and I've already invited in enough. I'm 91 years old now, and I've learned that the worst kind of loneliness isn't the kind you feel when you're alone. It's the kind you feel when you realize that something has been pretending to keep you company, and you can't quite remember when it first arrived. If these stories have stayed with you, make sure to subscribe. Leave a comment telling me which date was the most terrifying. And remember, sometimes it's better to be alone than to find out what answers when you call out into the dark. Because some things are very good at answering, and they never really leave.